passed America's atomic bomb secrets to Russia.
Saddam, as we said, dressed in this raincoat and black suit.
In 1995, pleaded guilty to all 4 murders.
We all kinda know the death penalty exists. You hear about it in the news, you see documentaries about it, but most people never really stop to think about what actually happens during an execution. The stuff that doesn't make it into the official reports. Because some of the most disturbing moments in modern history have played out behind execution chamber walls and on military airstrips at 3 in the morning. From government-sanctioned mass killings to botched injections that dragged on for nearly an hour.
Tonight, the saga of an airplane that doubled as an instrument of murder. During Argentina's ruthless dictatorship in the mid-70s,
between 1976 and 1983, Argentina was ruled by a military dictatorship that carried out one of the most brutal campaigns of state terrorism in Latin American history. They called it the Dirty War, and the regime's target list went way beyond armed guerrillas. Trade unionists, students, journalists, anyone even suspected of left-wing sympathies could be taken in the middle of the night by men in unmarked Ford Falcons. And the vast majority of those people were never seen again. The regime ran over 300 secret detention centers across the country, and prisoners inside them were tortured systematically. But the method that still haunts Argentina to this day is what they called the death flights, or vuelos de la muerte. And here is how it worked. Prisoners were told they were being transferred to another facility. They were injected with pentothal, a powerful sedative, to make them drowsy and completely unable to resist. Then, they were loaded onto military aircraft, stripped of their clothing, and thrown alive into the Rio de la Plata, or the Atlantic Ocean. According to former naval officer Adolfo Sailingo, these flights happened every Wednesday for at least 2 years, during 1977 and 1978, and he estimated they took between 1,500 and 2,000 lives in that period alone. Sailingo himself admitted to participating in 2 of these flights, during which 13 people were thrown from one and 17 from another. He said high-ranking officers came along on the flights to offer support to the junior officers carrying out the operation. And a doctor was present on each flight to administer a final dose of anesthetic to make sure prisoners couldn't fight back. One of the most notorious detention centers was the Navy School of Mechanics in Buenos Aires, known as ESMA. Roughly 5,000 prisoners passed through ESMA between 1976 and 1983, and only about 200 of them made it out alive. That is a 96% fatality rate at a single facility. Survivors described being taken to the basement upon arrival, where interrogation rooms were equipped with electric shock tables and water tanks used for a torture technique called the submarino. For decades, the Argentine government denied any of this happened. But in 1995, Sailingo broke the silence when he publicly confessed to journalist Horacio Verbitsky, and his account was later published in a book called The Flight. His confession sent shockwaves through Argentina because it was the first time a military officer had personally taken responsibility for the death flights. It became known as the Sailingo effect, and it opened the door for other confessions and investigations. In 2005, a Spanish court convicted Sailingo of crimes against humanity under Spain's universal jurisdiction laws. He was found guilty on 30 counts of murder, each carrying 21 years, plus additional time for illegal detention and torture. And ended in November 2017 with 29 former officials sentenced to life in prison. In 2023, one of the actual Skyvan aircraft proven to have been used in the death flights was tracked down in the United States, where it had most recently been used for skydiving in Arizona. Italian photographer Giancarlo Ceraudo had spent years searching for the planes and eventually traced this one to Florida through aircraft spotter websites. It was flown back to Argentina and is now on display at a human rights memorial in Buenos Aires. Human rights organizations estimate that up to 30,000 people were killed or disappeared during the entire Dirty War, and the death flights are still considered one of the most extreme methods of mass killing ever carried out by a modern government. Clayton Lockett, USA.
From the report today is that there was a discussion that went on inside the execution chamber among the...
On the 3rd of June 1999, a 19-year-old girl named Stephanie Neiman had just graduated from Perry High School in Oklahoma 2 weeks earlier. She was dropping off a friend at a house in Perry when she walked right into a home invasion already in progress. Clayton Lockett, who was 23 at the time, along with 2 accomplices, had broken into the home and were beating the homeowner over a debt. When Neiman arrived, Lockett tried to take the keys to her truck, but she fought back. He bound her hands with duct tape and covered her mouth. then drove her and the others to a remote location in Kay County. Even after being kidnapped, Neiman refused to say she would keep quiet, so Lockett shot her with a sawed-off shotgun. The first shot tore into her chest and shoulder but didn't kill her. His gun jammed, so he walked back to his vehicle, used a screwdriver to fix it, walked back, and shot her again at close range. That shot still wasn't fatal. Instead of shooting a third time, Lockett told one of his accomplices to bury her, and the accomplice informed him she was still alive when they started digging. In 2000, Lockett was convicted on 19 felony counts, including murder, rape, kidnapping, and forcible sodomy, and a jury sentenced him to death. His execution was scheduled for the 29th of April, 2014, and Oklahoma was using a brand new 3-drug protocol that had never been tested in the state before. The first drug was midazolam, which was supposed to render Lockett unconscious before the other 2 drugs were administered. But the problems started before any drugs were even given. Lockett had been dehydrating himself in the days leading up to the execution, and as a former intravenous drug user, his veins were in terrible shape. The paramedic assigned to start the IV spent a long time trying to find a usable vein. She tried his arms, his hands, his neck, and even his collarbone, and nothing worked. Eventually, they decided to insert the IV into his femoral vein through his groin, but they only had needles that were 1.25 inches long when they actually needed ones that were 2.5 inches. Because the groin area was exposed, the warden placed a blanket over Lockett to protect his dignity, which meant the doctor couldn't actually see the IV site at all. At 6:23 p.m., the first drug was administered. By 6:33, Lockett was declared unconscious, and the remaining drugs were pushed through the line. But about 3 minutes later, Lockett began to move. Witnesses said he started nodding, mumbling, and writhing on the gurney, and some described what looked like a seizure. When the doctor lifted the blanket, he found blood and clear liquid pooling around Lockett's groin, and there was swelling under the skin described as smaller than a tennis ball but larger than a golf ball. The vein had collapsed, and the drugs were leaking into his tissue instead of entering his bloodstream. At that point, prison officials tried to halt the execution, but there was no protocol for what to do next. Lockett was never formally pronounced dead during the procedure itself. He died of a heart attack at 7:06 p.m., a full 43 minutes after the first drug was administered. An autopsy later confirmed that the drugs did eventually kill him, but because the IV line failed, the whole process was drawn out far beyond what anyone expected. Oklahoma halted all pending executions and launched an investigation, and the conclusion was pretty straightforward. The IV access point failing was the single biggest reason everything went wrong. The American Civil Liberties Union of Oklahoma said the state had disgraced itself, and Human Rights Watch called it state-sanctioned torture. The case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, which heard arguments about the use of midazolam exactly 1 year after Lockett's execution. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, USA.
Party members knew that they faced possible death sentences in the event of their
At the height of the Cold War, when Senator Joseph McCarthy was leading his crusade against communism, and Americans were genuinely terrified that the Soviet Union could drop an atomic bomb on their cities, a married couple from New York became the center of the most controversial espionage case of the 20th century. Julius Rosenberg was an electrical engineer who had worked for the U.S. Army Signal Corps. He was recruited by Soviet agents around 1942, and by 1944, he was actively overseeing a small network of spies himself. One of the people he recruited was his own brother-in-law, David Greenglass, who happened to be working at the Los Alamos National Laboratory as part of the Manhattan Project. When the spy ring was uncovered in 1950, Greenglass was arrested first, and he immediately pointed the finger at Julius and Ethel. Julius was arrested on the 17th of June 1950, and Ethel was arrested 2 months later on August 11 after testifying before a grand jury. The thing is, the FBI's own director, J. Edgar Hoover, actually recommended a 30-year sentence for Ethel because the evidence against her was thin, and he believed she might eventually cooperate and give up more names while in prison. But the government charged her anyway, largely as leverage to pressure Julius into naming other members of the spy ring. Judge Irving Kaufman went even further and sentenced both of them to death. During sentencing, Kaufman accused them of a crime he considered worse than murder. Their trial lasted about 3 weeks, starting in March 1951, and the only testimony that actually linked Ethel to espionage came from her own brother, David, and his wife, Ruth. David Greenglass testified that Ethel had typed up notes containing classified information, making her the group's secretary and an active participant in the conspiracy. But decades later, in 2001, Greenglass admitted that he had committed perjury and that the testimony about Ethel typing up classified notes was fabricated to protect his own wife from prosecution. Ruth Greenglass had been given immunity in exchange for David's testimony. He served less than 10 years in prison and lived to be 92, dying in 2014. On the 19th of June, 1953, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were brought to the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. Julius went first. At 8:04 p.m., 3 shocks of 2,000 volts each were applied, each one causing his body to lurch forward in the chair with his hands clenched. He was pronounced dead at 8:06 p.m. Ethel was brought into the chamber just 2 minutes after her husband's body had been wheeled into an adjacent autopsy room less than 20 feet away. She walked in calmly at 8:11 p.m. wearing a dark green print dress and was strapped into the chair. The cathode element, which was soaked in a saline solution and shaped like a football helmet, was fitted to her head, and the executioner threw the switch. After the standard 3 shocks were applied, the attendants removed the strapping and the doctors checked for a pulse. Her heart was still beating. They had to strap her back into the chair and apply 2 more shocks. Witnesses reported that a thick white stream of smoke rose from the helmet on her head after the final jolts, and the entire process took about 4.5 minutes from start to finish. She was pronounced dead at 8:16 p.m. The Rosenbergs were the first American civilians ever put to death for espionage during peacetime, and Ethel is still the only American woman the federal government has executed for a crime other than murder. To this day, there is significant debate about whether her sentence was justified, and in 2016, the Rosenberg sons formally asked President Barack Obama to exonerate their mother. After Ethel's execution, Deputy Attorney General William Rogers reportedly said that she had called their bluff, acknowledging that the government had expected her to crack under the pressure and cooperate. Saddam Hussein, Iraq. When the Iraqi government broadcast footage of Saddam Hussein's execution on the 30th of December 2006, it was supposed to mark the end of an era, a moment of justice for a country that had suffered decades under his rule. But what happened inside the execution chamber that morning turned it into something far more complicated, and the fallout would deepen the sectarian violence already tearing Iraq apart. Saddam had been captured by US forces on the 13th of December 2003, pulled from a small underground hiding spot near his hometown of Tikrit after months on the run. He remained in US custody at Camp Cropper in Baghdad throughout his trial. He was convicted on the 5th of November 2006 for crimes against humanity connected to the 1982 Dujail massacre. In that attack, 148 Shiite men and boys were killed on his orders in retaliation for an assassination attempt against him in the town of Dujail during the Iran-Iraq War. The trial was conducted by the Iraqi Special Tribunal, and when the verdict came down, Saddam reportedly shouted his support for the people of Iraq and denounced his accusers. After sentencing, he made one specific request. He asked to be executed by firing squad rather than hanging, arguing that as the former commander-in-chief of the Iraqi military, a firing squad was the lawful military form of capital punishment. The court denied that request. The execution was carried out at Camp Justice, a joint Iraqi-American military base in Kaziman, a suburb of northeast Baghdad. It happened just before dawn, at approximately 6 a.m. local time, on the first day of Eid al-Adha, one of the holiest days in the Islamic calendar. That timing was itself deeply controversial, and multiple governments and international organizations criticized the decision. The Iraqi government released official video footage that showed Saddam being led to the gallows and ended right after the noose was placed around his neck. But a cell phone recording made by someone in the room told a very different story. In that footage, you can see and hear guards and officials surrounding Saddam, jeering at him and chanting the name of Shiite cleric Muqtada al-Sadr while he stood on the scaffold with the rope around his neck. The scene was chaotic and ugly, and it looked far more like a sectarian revenge killing than a formal act of justice. Even US President George W. Bush later described the execution as fumbled and said it reinforced doubts about whether the Iraqi government was serious. The UN's Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Executions issued a formal statement, saying the humiliating manner of the execution clearly violated human rights law. As the trapdoor opened, Saddam was in the middle of reciting the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith, and the rope cut him off mid-sentence. The rope broke his neck, and he was pronounced dead within minutes. A second unofficial video emerged days later showing his body on a trolley, with what appeared to be a significant wound on his neck that fueled speculation the hanging had been carried out improperly. His body was transported by US military helicopter to his birthplace of Al-Auja near Tikrit, where he was buried the next day, December 31, about 2 miles from the graves of his sons Uday and Qusay. The manner of the execution had consequences that went far beyond the chamber itself. Journalist Mohammed Badsi later wrote that the way Saddam was killed actually deepened the civil war that had been raging inside Iraq since early 2006. In the days that followed, Saddam became something of a hero to Sunni Arabs who saw his calm defiance in the face of Shiite executioners as a symbol of resistance. Human Rights Watch estimated that during his roughly 24 years in power, Saddam's regime was responsible for the deaths or disappearances of between 250,000 and 290,000 Iraqis. His eldest daughter, Ragad, who was living under asylum in Jordan, had requested that his body be temporarily buried in Yemen until Iraq could be liberated, but that request was denied. Ronnie Lee Gardner, USA.
I think there was a time when I couldn't stop. I think something in my brain would not allow me.
Here is something that is kind of hard to wrap your head around. In 2010, a man in the state of Utah was executed by a team of 5 marksmen who fired rifles into his chest. That was not the 1800s. That was the 18th of June, 2010. Ronnie Lee Gardner had a childhood that reads like a checklist of everything that can go wrong. He was born in Salt Lake City in 1961, the youngest of 7 children. His father left the family when Ronnie was a toddler, and by 18 months old, he was found malnourished and wandering the streets alone in a diaper. He endured physical and sexual abuse growing up, started huffing gas and glue as a child, and contracted meningitis at age 4, which his lawyers later argued may have caused brain damage. In October 1984, Gardner killed a man named Melvin Otterstrom during a robbery at a Salt Lake City bar, where Otterstrom was working to earn extra money. Then, in April 1985, while being transported to a court hearing for that crime, someone smuggled a gun to him and he shot attorney Michael Burdell during a failed escape attempt at the courthouse. He also wounded a bailiff named George Kirk, whose family said Kirk died 11 years later from injuries sustained in that shooting. Gardner was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Because his sentence came down before Utah eliminated the firing squad as an option in 2004, he was given a choice between that and lethal injection. He chose the firing squad, and he told his lawyer he simply preferred it. The firing squad has deep roots in Utah, partly because of the Mormon concept of blood atonement, the idea that certain sins require the spilling of one's own blood for redemption. Gardner later confirmed his choice was connected to his Mormon background. He spent nearly 25 years on death row, and his case went through appeal after appeal. 3 of the original jurors who sentenced him even signed an affidavit saying they would have recommended life without parole if it had been available, but Utah didn't allow that option until 1992. On June 15, 3 days before his execution, Gardner ate a last meal of steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and 7-Up. Then, he began a 48-hour fast for spiritual reasons and spent his final hours watching the Lord of the Rings trilogy and reading a novel called Divine Justice. At midnight on June 18, Gardner was woken from a nap and walked voluntarily to the execution chamber at Utah State Prison in Draper. He was strapped into a black metal chair on a raised platform with sandbags behind him to absorb ricochets. 5 anonymous law enforcement officers, all volunteers, stood 25 feet away behind a brick wall with a gun port, each armed with a .30 caliber Winchester rifle. One rifle was loaded with a blank, so none of them would know for certain who fired the fatal shot. When asked if he had any last words, Gardner simply said he did not. A black hood was placed over his head, and a small circular target was pinned over his heart. After a countdown from 5 to 2, the shots were fired at 12:15 a.m. 4 bullets hit Gardner's chest, perforating his heart and lungs, and a metal tray beneath the chair collected his blood. Witnesses said his fist clenched after the shots, and his arm moved up and down at the elbow for about 2 minutes before a medical examiner checked his neck for a pulse and shined a flashlight into his eyes under the hood. He was pronounced dead at 12:17 a.m., just 2 minutes after the shots were fired. After the chamber was cleaned, reporters were allowed in to inspect it, and the only evidence of what had happened were 4 bullet holes in the wood panels behind the chair. Gardner was the 3rd person executed by firing squad in the United States since capital punishment was reinstated in 1976, and all 3 of those executions took place in Utah. Jesse Tafero, USA.
The system of giving the death penalty is so discriminatory and racist.
Jesse Joseph Tafero was convicted of murder and executed via electric chair in the state of Florida for the murders of Florida Highway Patrol Officer Philip Black and Donald Irwin, a visiting Canadian constable and friend of Black.
The 4th of May, 1990, was supposed to be a routine execution in the state of Florida, but what happened in the death chamber that morning became one of the most graphic failures in the history of American capital punishment. Jesse Tafero had been convicted for the 1,976 murders of 2 law enforcement officers, 39-year-old Florida Highway Patrol Officer Philip Black and 39-year-old Ontario Provincial Police Corporal Donald Irwin, a Canadian constable who was visiting Florida and happened to be riding along with Black that day. The 2 officers had approached a car parked at a rest stop for a routine check and found Tafero, his wife Sunny Jacobs, their 2 children, who were 9 years old and 10 months old, and a man named Walter Rhodes asleep inside. Officer Black noticed a gun on the floor of the car and asked the occupants to step out. What happened next is still disputed to this day, and the uncertainty over who actually pulled the trigger is what makes this case so deeply troubling. Rhodes, who was the driver, testified at trial that Tafero grabbed the gun and shot both officers, but Tafero maintained that it was Rhodes who fired the shots and then handed him the weapon. And the forensic evidence didn't clear things up either, because gunpowder residue was found on both men in a way that was consistent with either having fired a gun or just having handled one recently. Rhodes cut a deal with prosecutors. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for his testimony against Tafero and Jacobs. Both Tafero and Jacobs were convicted of first-degree murder. The jury recommended death for Tafero and life for Jacobs, though Jacobs was also initially sentenced to death before that was later overturned on appeal. On the morning of the execution, Tafero was strapped into Florida's electric chair, the one they called Old Sparky, which had been in use since 1924 and had already been used in hundreds of executions over the decades. When the executioner threw the switch, something went horribly wrong. 6-inch flames erupted from the headpiece attached to Tafero's head. The cause was traced back to a simple but catastrophic mistake. Someone on the execution team had purchased a synthetic sponge from a regular store instead of a natural sea sponge. See, the sponge goes inside the headpiece to conduct electricity more efficiently and make sure the person dies quickly, but synthetic material doesn't handle current the same way at all. Instead of channeling the electricity through, it caught fire. The first jolt failed to kill Tafero. A second shock was applied, and again flames shot from his head. Then a third. One witness described 7 minutes of heaving, nodding, flame, and smoke before the prison doctor finally pronounced him dead. The spectacle was so disturbing that it reportedly helped inspire Stephen King to write a similar execution scene in his novel The Green Mile. But the worst part came after Tafero was already dead. Walter Rhodes, the key witness who had testified that Tafero pulled the trigger, recanted his testimony on 3 separate occasions, in 1977, 1979, and 1982, each time saying he himself had shot the officers. He later went back to his original story, but the question of who actually fired the weapon has never been resolved. Jacobs, meanwhile, had her death sentence overturned and was eventually freed after years of legal battles. Her story was later featured in the play and television film The Exonerated. Tafero's execution forced Florida and several other states to seriously reconsider electrocution as their primary method, and it became a major turning point in the shift toward lethal injection. But Florida kept using the electric chair. A nearly identical malfunction happened again in 1997 during the execution of Pedro Medina, and another botched electrocution in 1999 left inmate Alan Lee Davis with blood pouring from his face while he remained alive for roughly 10 minutes. A Florida Supreme Court justice later described those 3 executions collectively as barbaric spectacles and acts more befitting a violent murderer than a civilized state. Mass executions. Iran, 1,988.
Abdullah Said Moradi's brother Jabbar disappeared from prison in 1988. He has never been found. His parents spent years looking for answers.
Between late July and September of 1988, the Iranian government carried out what multiple human rights organizations have called the largest wave of political executions since the early 1980s. And for decades, the authorities denied it ever happened. It started after Iran accepted UN Security Council Resolution 598, which officially ended the devastating 8-year war with Iraq that had cost over 1 million lives on both sides. Around the same time, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, an opposition group known as the Mekhe, launched an armed incursion into western Iran called Operation Mersad, which the Iranian army repelled. But according to Ayatollah Montazeri, who was Iran's deputy supreme leader at the time, the government had been planning mass executions of political prisoners for years and simply used the Mekhe's attack as a convenient justification to move forward. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa ordering the execution of all imprisoned political opponents who remained loyal to the opposition. The decree specifically targeted members of the Mekhe, stating that those who supported the organization were waging war on God and were condemned to death. But the killings went much further than just Mekhe members. Prisoners affiliated with leftist factions, the Communist Tudeh Party, and other political groups were also swept up in the executions. To carry out the killings, the government formed what became known as death commissions in at least 32 cities across the country. In Tehran, the commission consisted of 4 men: Sharia judge Hossein Ali Nayeri, prosecutor Morteza Eshraghi, Intelligence Ministry representative Mostafa Pourmohammadi, and deputy prosecutor Ebrahim Raisi. Raisi later went on to become the president of Iran in 2021, and his involvement in the 1988 killings earned him the nickname the Butcher of Tehran. The process was chilling in how mechanical it was. Prisoners were brought before these commissions blindfolded, and the interrogation lasted only a few minutes. They were asked about their political beliefs, whether they were willing to denounce their organizations, whether they would express repentance, and in some cases, whether they were willing to execute fellow dissidents. Those who refused to comply were taken straight to their deaths, and a lot of these people had already been tried and were serving prison sentences for things like handing out leaflets and going to demonstrations, and some were actually close to being released. Survivors have described waiting in hallways, blindfolded, hearing other prisoners being taken away and never coming back. One account from Gohardasht prison describes a prisoner named Kaveh Nesari who had epilepsy and could not walk on his own. Another prisoner had to physically carry him to the gallows. The bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves, many of them at Kavaran Cemetery in Tehran. The Iranian government has since tried to erase the evidence by bulldozing the cemetery and building over it with new plots and roads. Families who tried to find out what happened to their loved ones were met with silence and outright threats. Some were told their relatives had been executed months after the fact but were given no death certificates, no documentation, and no information about where they were buried. Amnesty International published a landmark 2018 report titled Blood-Soaked Secrets, which put the minimum death toll at approximately 5,000. Other estimates from historians and opposition groups range much higher, with some claiming up to 30,000 political prisoners were killed. Montazeri himself, before falling out of favor with the regime, confronted the Tehran Death Commission directly, telling them that the greatest crime in the history of the Islamic Republic had been committed by their hands. A leaked audio recording of that confrontation later surfaced and became a critical piece of evidence in the case against the regime. In July 2024, the UN Special Rapporteur on Iran concluded in a formal report that the 1,988 executions amounted to crimes against humanity, including murder, extermination, and genocide. The report noted that the executions included women, some of whom were reportedly assaulted before being killed, as well as a significant number of people who were minors at the time of their imprisonment. As of today, no Iranian official has been held accountable for the killings. Hamida Jandoubi, France.
Jandoubi was a Tunisian sentenced to death in France. He was a Tunisian agricultural worker and convicted murderer. He moved to Marseille, France, in 1968, and 6 years later he kidnapped.
Today,
the death penalty has been abolished in France. Although a few modern-day French politicians advocate restoring the death penalty, its re-establishment would not be possible without the unilateral French rejection of several international treaties.
Okay, here is a fact that surprises a lot of people. The last time a government in the Western world used a guillotine to execute someone was the 10th of September, 1977. That was the same year Star Wars came out, and the same year kids in America were lining up to buy the Atari 2600. The person executed that day was Hamida Jandoubi, a Tunisian man living in Marseille, France. Jandoubi had moved to France from Tunisia in 1968 and worked at a grocery store before getting a job as a landscaper. In 1971, he had a terrible workplace accident when his leg got caught in the tracks of a tractor, and he lost about 2/3 of his right leg as a result. While recovering in the hospital, he met a 21-year-old woman named Elisabeth Bousquet. They began a relationship, but it turned violent and abusive. In 1973, Bousquet went to the police and filed a complaint, saying Jandoubi had tried to force her into prostitution. He was convicted and spent time in prison for that, but when he got out, he went after her. He kidnapped Bousquet, tortured her, and ultimately murdered her. What he did to her was brutal enough that the court didn't hesitate to sentence him to death on the 25th of February, 1977. Jandoubi appealed, but the appeal was rejected on June 9. Then he applied for clemency from President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who had publicly expressed his personal dislike of the death penalty, but had already allowed 2 other executions to proceed during his presidency. Giscard denied the clemency request. On the morning of the 10th of September, 1977, Jandoubi was woken early and told that his execution would proceed. A judge named Monique Maberly had been appointed to witness the execution, and she later wrote a detailed record of what she saw. Brown blankets had been spread along the prison corridors to muffle the sound of footsteps so the other inmates wouldn't hear the procession. Tables with basins of water and towels were set up at intervals along the route. Because Jandoubi had an artificial leg, it took extra time for him to get ready, and the group waited in silence while he was prepared. According to Maybelly, Jandoubi was calm and did not cry out or resist. He was led to the courtyard of Baumet's prison where the guillotine was set up. His hands were tied behind his back, and he was positioned face down on the machine. Maybelly wrote that everything happened very quickly. She turned away at the moment of impact out of what she described as instinctive modesty, and when she turned back, she saw a tremendous amount of very red blood. She wrote that a man who had been speaking less than a minute earlier was reduced to a blue pajama top in a wicker basket. A guard immediately picked up a hose to wash away the traces. Marcel Chevalier, France's last chief executioner, carried out the procedure after taking over the role in 1976. The guillotine had been France's standard method of execution since the Revolution in 1792, when the government decided that all death sentences would be carried out by one uniform method, regardless of social class. During the Reign of Terror between 1793 and 1794, roughly 17,000 people were guillotined, including King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. The last public guillotine execution had taken place in 1939, when serial killer Eugen Weidmann was beheaded in front of hundreds of spectators, but the crowd grew so riotous that France banned public executions from that point on. By the 1970s, France was among the last countries in Western Europe still carrying out executions at all, and only 8 people had been guillotined between 1965 and 1977. 4 years after Jandoubi's execution, newly elected President François Mitterrand signed a law on the 9th of October, 1981, abolishing capital punishment in France. Justice Minister Robert Badinter argued on the floor of the National Assembly that France must not have a law that kills, and the 7 people remaining on death row had their sentences commuted to life in prison. Jandoubi's execution remains the last government-sanctioned beheading in the Western world.